Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. I'm not quite sure what this video is. It's concerning Syria, but also in the context of Russia, to give us an idea of what's going on there and how it might impact Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. Okay, so just to let you know where Syria is, let's start from the basics. You've got the Black Sea here, you've got Ukraine up here, you've got Russia up here coming down, you've got Georgia. Georgia then goes on to Turkey down here, and Azerbaijan, and then we have Syria cushioned between Turkey and Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and the Mediterranean. And there is this Port Tartus here on the Mediterranean, which is the entire reason, in my opinion, that Russia is involved in supporting the Assad regime, because it gives you a warm water deep sea port on the Mediterranean that they can use. They have repair facilities and whatnot for their naval ships, etc., etc. So that is why I think Russia are predominantly supporting the Assad regime in Syria. You have this very long civil war that's been going on, and the Assad regime has been pretty horrific, and there are lots of different rebel forces fighting against the Assad regime. And the difficulty is that some of those forces fighting against the bad guys are themselves bad guys. So you've got ISIS and other jihadists fighting against the Assad regime. And so is the enemy of my enemy my friend, or should we be friends with ISIS? And this is what's really not helped matters there, because then you also have like the Kurds who have been fighting in Syria against the Assad regime, but then Turkey fighting against the Assad regime, supporting some of the rebel groups. They are not fans of the Kurds. And it all gets very complicated because the US have been fans of the Kurds, been supporting the Kurdish fights against ISIS, and it's all just a bit crazy. Anyway, let's read this Ashaq al-Awsat article on what's been going on in the last few days, because Aleppo has basically fallen to the rebels, and that's the second biggest city in Syria, and it's just fallen basically in 3 days, and that's been quite incredible. So what to know about the sudden gains of the opposition in Syria's 13-year war and why it matters. Okay, we're going to read this whole article. It's not very long, but I think it gives us a really good synopsis. So the 13-year civil war in Syria has rolled back into prominence with a surprise opposition offensive on Aleppo, one of Syria's largest cities and an ancient business hub. The push is among the opposition's strongest in years, in a war whose destabilizing effects have rippled far beyond the country's borders. It was the first opposition attack on Aleppo since 2016, when a brutal air campaign by Russian warplanes helped Syrian President Bashar al-Assad retake the northwestern city. So it was under the control in 2015 of the opposition forces, but it was retaken by the Assad regime with huge assistance from the Russians. And they retook that northwestern city. Now, intervention by Russia and Iran and Iranian-backed, Iranian-allied Hezbollah and other groups has allowed Assad to remain in power. So you've got Russia, Iran, Hezbollah on the side of Bashar al-Assad, and you have this collection of rebels against him, and then the US going, well, we're broadly, or many Western forces being broadly against the Assad regime, but thinking, we shouldn't be that close with some of these forces. So anyway, Assad's been able to remain in power with the help of those allies and other groups within controlling 70% of Syria. The surge in fighting has raised the prospect of another violent front reopening in the Middle East, at a time when US-backed Israel is fighting Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, both Iranian-allied groups. Okay, let's look back at the map there. Not that map. We're going to go back to the main map we have of Syria. Where have I put that? There you go. So we have down the side of Syria, you have Lebanon here, and they have Hezbollah, who are being fought against by the Israelis, and Hezbollah are supported by Iran, which is over here, and Iran is supporting Syria. Hezbollah is supporting Syria in terms of Bashar al-Assad, Russia, and some other groups as well. What it looks like at the moment, if you check this map out, is you've got, so this is Syria. In the sort of orangey pink color, you have that's the control of Bashar al-Assad. In the white area, you've got this HTS rebel grouping that is at the moment moving on Aleppo, or has taken Aleppo. Then you've got US-backed Kurds and other people up here. You've got the Turks coming in here, but they're not fans of the Kurds. So Turkish-supported rebel forces here, and then you've got another set of rebel forces down there. So that green at the bottom is controlled by the Revolutionary Commando Army and the United States Armed Forces. Then you have the Turkish Armed Forces and the Syrian interim government up here in the green. And then you've got that kind of yellowish area, the Rojava SDF. I think that might be Kurds and US helping out there as well. The white is the HTS Syrian Salvation Government. So you've got all of these different groups trying to have control. You've got also Islamic State, military of the Islamic State in a black area. So I presume is at these areas there, possibly maybe other areas as well. So really diverse set of people involved in the war there. Now, Robert Ford, the last serving US ambassador to Syria, pointed to months of Israeli strikes on Syrian and Hezbollah targets in the area, and to Israel's ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon this week as factors providing Syria's opposition groups with the opportunity to advance. Here's a look at some of the key aspects of the new fighting. Why does the fighting in Aleppo matter? Assad has been at war with opposition forces seeking his overthrow for 13 years, a conflict that's killed an estimated 500,000 people. Some 6.8 million Syrians have fled the country, a refugee flow that helped change the political map in Europe by fueling anti-immigrant far-right movements. The roughly 30% of the country not under Assad is controlled by a range of opposition forces and foreign troops. The US has about 900 troops in northeast Syria, far from Aleppo, to guard against the resurgence of ISIS extremist group. Both the US and Israel conduct occasional strikes in Syria against government forces and Iran-allied militias. Turkey has forces in Syria as well and has influence with a broad alliance of opposition forces storming Aleppo. Coming after years with few sizable changes in territory between Syria's warring parties, the fighting has the potential to really quite consequential and potentially game-changing if Syrian government forces prove unable to hold their ground, said Charles Lister, a long-time Syria analyst with the US-based Middle East Institute. Risks include if ISIS fighters see it as an opening, Lister said. So there could be some dangerous situations that come about from this, where the forces that we're not particularly fond of actually come into the ascendancy. So if ISIS take advantage of the growing chaos there. So it is certainly very challenging. Ford said the fighting in Aleppo would become more broadly destabilizing if it drew Russia and Turkey, each with its own interests to protect in Syria, into direct heavy fighting against each other. So this is fascinating, and I know it's horrific, but you've got Turkey against Bashar al-Assad, but Turkey straddle the fence in supporting Russia because they kind of money launder Russia's money and accept trade, but they are in broadly political support of Ukraine. And yet here they are potentially coming directly up against the Russian-supported Assad regime. And in fact, you get to the point where people are saying Turkey has deployed S-400 air defense systems against Russian planes. As far as I can tell, says PS01, friendly fire works well with Russian-made air defense systems. Good choice. This is a really complex situation. Anyway, let us carry on. So what do we know about the group leading the offence on Aleppo? The US and UN have long designated the opposition force leading the attack at Aleppo, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known by its initials as HTS, as a terrorist organisation. So this is a bit of a problem, that actually the people taking Aleppo, and everyone's like, yeah, this is brilliant, this is great, Assad's in a lot of trouble, the Russians are in a lot of trouble, but actually these guys aren't necessarily like super good guys. Its leader, Abu Mohammed al-Golani, emerged as leader of Al-Qaeda's Syria branch in 2011 in the first months of Syria's war. His fight was an unwelcome intervention to many in Syria's opposition, who hoped to keep the fight against Assad's brutal rule untainted by violent extremism. So the problem is you've got some people who genuinely kind of rebels who want democracy and so on, and then you've got rebels who want theocracy and extremism themselves. Golani early on claimed responsibility for deadly bombings, pledged an attack on Western forces, and sent religious police to enforce modest dress by women. Golani has sought to remake himself in recent years. He renounced his al-Qaeda ties in 2016. He's disbanded his religious police force, cracked down on extremist groups in his territory, and portrayed himself as a protector of other religions. That includes last year allowing the first Christian mass in the city of Idlib in years. So interesting sort of slight shift there. What's the history of Aleppo in the war? At the crossroads of trade routes and empires for thousands of years, Aleppo is one of the centres of commerce and culture in the Middle East. Aleppo was home to 2.3 million people before the war. Opposition forces seized the east side of the city in 2012, and it became the proudest symbol of the advance of armed opposition factions. But in 2016, government forces backed by Russians' airstrikes laid siege to the city. Russian shells, missiles and crude barrel bombs, fuel canisters and other containers loaded with explosives and metal methodically levelled neighbourhoods. Starving and under siege, the opposition surrendered Aleppo that year. The Russian military's entry was a turning point in the war, allowing Assad to stay on in the territory he held. This year, Israeli airstrikes in Aleppo have hit Hezbollah weapons depots and Syrian forces, among other targets, according to an independent monitoring group. Israel rarely acknowledges strikes at Aleppo and other government-held areas of Syria. So there's so much going on here. So many different forces are at play in Syria, and not least, obviously Israel. And Turkey doing strikes as well, and Russia doing strikes. This is, I don't know if you can call it a proxy war, but my goodness, there are a number of different international entities involved there. So over the last 3 days, Aleppo, and let's put that on the, just remind you, sorry, where that is on the map, that is up here in the northwest of Syria. That has come under a lot of pressure from the groupings of these the whites on the map, the HTS forces. They have just made really significant gains very quickly, to the point they've captured the citadel in the middle. In fact, they pretty much captured all of Aleppo, as we can understand at the moment. Rebels are now pouring into Aleppo, roaming the streets freely. It seems like all the SAA forces have left the city. In other words, the Bashar al-Assad forces. More videos of tanks and BMPs captured by rebels. The amount of armoured vehicles left behind by the SAA in the last 3 days is staggering. There's so much video footage of the equipment being taken or being left behind. Here's another drive-through piece of footage from the town of Abu Duhur and its nearby airbase in eastern Idlib, and I'll show you where I understand Idlib to be. Here are just huge amounts of military equipment, pieces of military equipment being left behind by the SAS. It looks like the regime left behind many vehicles and pieces of artillery. And so Idlib is an area that is basically this area here, that white area there, which is broadly under control of the kind of rebel forces, the HCS, but they are moving at the moment slowly eastwards while taking Aleppo, and also there are forces coming in from the north as well. So all these different kind of rebel forces with their tails up, looking to take advantage of the disarray and the chaos of the SAA troops. Reports indicate that the Kuwera's military airbase in Syria, a key Russian military installation since 2015, was attacked by rebels. In the summer of 2024, it was also attacked by Ukrainian special forces. The operation targeted Russian military assets, including advanced electronic warfare systems. So that's something I think I reported on previously. OSINT Technical says, my only commentary on Aleppo right now is that Syrian rebel forces probably need to send the Ukrainian armed forces a fruit basket. Russian assets backing Assad in Syria have fairly clearly been degraded, with the Russian Air Force flailing right now. This is the idea that actually the Russians have been somewhat weaker in supporting Assad because they've been distracted elsewhere by predominantly Ukraine. Seeing some parallels in 2022 in Ukraine as well, where Russian forces lacking solid targeting information reverted back to bombing civilian targets, though not to scant in the years of terror bombing already seen against Syrian civilians. So now the Russians are hitting Aleppo with some serious carpet bombing, and not just Aleppo. So the Russians are gone so effing crazy, says this source. Russian warplanes are targeting children and civilian homes in the city of Idlib. Screw Russia is that claim there. I mean, some pretty horrific footage coming out, by the way. But Russia will lose its only warm water port in the Mediterranean Sea as rebels keep advancing, is the claim here. So Russians would definitely be worrying if they're going to lose Tartus down here. Now, it's a long way from the rebel-held territory at the moment, but if they lose Aleppo, the second biggest city, then that's going to give the rebel forces a lot of momentum. So that is definitely a concern for the Russians there. And Russian channels specializing in naval topics are growing concerned about the base in Tartus and the Russian Navy's only repair and replenishment point in the Mediterranean. So here's a Russian source saying escalation in Syria and the Tartus base. The pace of the militants' offensive, their numbers, the direct involvement of Turkish military forces, and the yet unused trump card, American terrorist units in eastern Syria, have not yet been deployed in combat, along with the performance of the Syrian Arab army units suggest that the Russian Navy's presence in the Mediterranean might be in jeopardy. While Russia might still be able to allocate aviation support for Syria, deploying troops to defend at least Tartus, such as naval infantry since it's a naval base, is currently a major challenge. Unless conscripts are brought into play, we'll see how the situation develops, but the risk is very real and growing. And of course, the ability for Russia to help Syria is, as already mentioned, completely constrained by the amount of resources they're pouring into Ukraine and the amount of degradation that has been taking place of the Russian forces, that they are just in a worse position now than they've ever been to be able to support Syria or Bashar al-Assad, or al-Assad, as some people say. Jay in Kiev says, as of yesterday, Russians are getting destroyed in Syria. Assad is in Moscow begging for weapons. So the other point of note is that Assad has gone to Moscow. So it's that... I don't know whether that's a safety thing or cap in hand, but he's in Moscow at the moment, and it could be that the regime is on the brink of collapse. It might not nearly be so serious as that, though. But Assad is in Moscow begging for weapons. Russian defense minister is in Pyongyang begging for weapons. So you've got Belousov is over in Pyongyang, North Korea, asking for weapons for Russia to be able to use. Russia's had its worst 24 hours of losses in the war in Ukraine. 2,030 soldiers were lost yesterday. We've got another 1,700 odd lost today. Georgians rising up against the Russian-backed government. So there were big protests in Georgia last night that were pretty huge. One of the worst months in history for the Russian ruble, and things are not going well for the whole Moscow regime. At the moment, it's a very chaotic 24, 48, 72 hours. Now, Anton Gerashenko says, I'd like to offer you an analysis of the situation in Syria based on recent comments from the Russian segment of Telegram. Let me know what you think. Pinch of salt and all that. Apart from the gloom and regret that Wagner and Prigozhin are no longer around, Russians say that in essence the situation has returned to what it was like in 2015 since the entry of the Russian troops into Syria. Russians claim that one of the main reasons Russia intervened in Syria was the issue of TurkStream and Turkey's refusal of Russia's proposed 4-pipeline format with 15 billion cubic meters per year for each pipe. The Turks insisted on 2 pipes, one for transit and the other for the Turkish market with a 10% discount. Russia disagreed and the war in Syria began. So although I talk about Tartars being one of the main reasons, there are obviously other reasons. The Turks Russia disagreed and the war in Syria began. Russians note with sadness that the Turks did not allow Gazprom to implement its version of TurkStream, and in 2018 the 2 pipe sections of the stream were utilized. Russia perceived this as its capitulation and defeat. Now Russia is facing the closure of the Ukrainian transit starting January the 1st. Russia will lose 15 billion cubic meters of exports and will be left with only one pipeline of TurkStream. Gazprom claims it has already prepared for the cessation of gas transit through Ukraine and that everything is stable. In reality, Gazprom's stock prices have fallen and will continue to decline, unlike gas prices for ordinary Russians. Amid the devaluation of the ruble, Gazprom, which was once repeatedly called Russia's national treasure, is gradually headed towards bankruptcy. Russian public forums state that TurkStream 2 project has come to a halt due to Turkey's extortionate conditions, a 1-year payment delay for already delivered gas, a 25% discount on all volumes, and a transfer of all gas to the border of Turkey's ownership to Turkey's ownership, with Turkey wanting to sell the gas independently without Gazprom. In other words, Gazprom will have no European exports left and Turkey wants to take all it has. This is fascinating because, like I've said to you before, Russia is in the weakest bargaining position it's ever been. So China is taking advantage of it. India is taking advantage of it. It's like, if you want hydrocarbons, now's your time to go and do a deal with Russia because they are desperate, right? And so Turkey is actually bending Russia over a desk here because they have no ability to stand up to Turkey because they're being sanctioned left, right and centre. So Turkey are then putting in all of these demands on Russia that would in normal times be somewhat less acceptable, but since 2014, since Russia's been sanctioned from the Crimea incident onwards, it is easier and easier to take advantage of Russia. Based on the situation in Syria, it seems that Turkey will be able to impose even tougher conditions on Russia and start bargaining. Gas is unlikely to be the only negotiating chip, but it is quite important. So that's to bear in mind as well. Now, the question is, what's going to happen? Will there be a larger capitulation of the Syrian forces, the Assad forces, or will the Russians pour lots of resources in? So we are hearing now that the Russians are sending equipment to Syria, but when you don't have all that much equipment to spare, it's not as easy as that. And yes, they are carpet bombing, apparently places in Idlib, which is this kind of area, as well as Aleppo. They're smashing Aleppo at the moment. It is still like super challenging for the Russians to be able to help the Syrians as much as Assad would like. And this is very distracting for Russia. It drains more resources away from Ukraine, arguably, and this will all work in Ukraine's favour. And although, like a couple of weeks ago, it was all looking like Russia are getting help from North Korea. Russia, people, some of the Russian mill bloggers are calling for North Korean soldiers to be sent into Syria. Right, so you suddenly got coming out of nowhere. Suddenly got a situation where, if Georgia if it continues to protest really bravely, and if in Romania you get a repudiation of the pro-Russian leader there in the second round of the presidential elections, fingers crossed. If it goes wrong for Russia in Syria, if the ruble keeps tanking, the economy keeps going down the pan, and if Ukraine are able to get continued assistance from the US in the next 6 weeks, as Biden piles everything he can into Ukraine, and then Trump actually pivots somewhat on Ukraine, then you can see Russia suddenly being in an awful lot more trouble than they previously were. Anyway, that's my tuppence. I'm no expert at all on Syria, and if I've got things wrong, I do apologise, let me know. But hopefully that gives you a bit more contextual understanding to what's going on there, so that we can properly understand its impact on Ukraine going forward. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you very soon with my first news update of the day regarding Ukraine more explicitly.